Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. Around the world, people are asking, how did India just shock the United States with one move? And more importantly, and what does this tell us about the changing global landscape? Let me take you through this moment step by step, because it's not only a story of politics, it's a lesson in international relations, economics, and leadership. For decades, the U.S. has been seen as the dominant voice in global affairs. Its alliances, policies, and pressure shape the decisions of many countries. Yet, India has just signaled something remarkable, that it will not be compelled by outside pressure, even from Washington. Instead, it is asserting a vision of sovereignty, independence, and national interest that is uniquely its own. This is not defiance for the sake of defiance. It is strategy. India is saying to the world, we are not a follower. We are a partner, and we will engage on equal footing. This decision should not be seen in isolation. It reflects a larger pattern where India has been carefully balancing multiple relationships. On one hand, it maintains strong ties with the United States in technology, defense, and democracy building. On the other hand, it continues to engage with Russia, China, and regional partners. This is what scholars call multi-alignment. It is not neutrality. It is not non-alignment in the old Cold War sense. Instead, it is a dynamic and flexible strategy that allows India to maximize its options and minimize its vulnerabilities. That is what makes this move so consequential. Now, let us ask, why does this matter for the United States? Because Washington is learning, sometimes the hard way, that the 21st century is not an era of unilateral commands. It is an era of negotiation, respect, and partnership. And the fact that India felt confident enough to say no to American pressure reflects both India's rising power and the world's changing balance. It means that U.S. policymakers must adapt to a reality where emerging powers like India are not junior partners, but co-authors of the international order. This is not a threat, it is an opportunity. For students and observers of world politics, India's move is a case study in resilience. It shows how a nation can build its economic base, strengthen its democracy, invest in education and technology, and use these strengths to stand tall globally. A country that depends entirely on others cannot make bold decisions, but a country that builds from within has the freedom to act with confidence. That is the deeper message behind India's choice. So what should we learn from this moment? First, sovereignty is not given. It is earned through decades of preparation. Second, diplomacy in our time is about balance, not loyalty to one camp. And third, the future will not belong to those who pressure others, but to those who listen, negotiate, and respect. India's move is a reminder that the world is shifting, and we must all shift with it. Thank you. India's recent action has made it abundantly clear that the foundation of its foreign policy is not shaped by pressure from outside powers, but rather by its own sense of sovereignty, self-reliance, and national interest. To appreciate the significance of this, one must look at the history of India's engagement with the world. For decades, India was often seen as a country navigating carefully between global powers, dependent on external support in areas such as technology, defense, or even aid. But today, India is showing a very different face to the world, a nation that has matured, that has invested in its own strengths, and that is now confident enough to say, we will decide our course, not because someone else demands it, but because it serves the long-term interests of our people. This is a moment of profound change, and it is worth examining in detail. When we say sovereignty, we often think of the simple right of a country to govern itself. But in the modern world, sovereignty is not just about political independence. It is about economic autonomy, energy security, technological capacity, and the ability to make decisions without fear of external coercion. India's recent choice demonstrates exactly this. It is a statement that while partnerships are welcome and cooperation with allies is important, no nation has the authority to dictate India's path. This is what distinguishes a dependent state from a truly independent one. India is no longer asking permission, it is asserting its place. To many in Washington, this may come as a shock because the U.S. has long grown accustomed to other nations aligning closely with its policy preferences. For smaller states, the cost of resistance has often been too high, whether in terms of economic sanctions or political isolation. But India is different. It has invested over decades in becoming self-reliant in food production through the Green Revolution. in building an advanced space program that demonstrates its scientific capabilities, and in nurturing a thriving technology sector that powers not only its own economy, but also the global digital system. These are not minor achievements. They are the building blocks of independence. When a nation controls its own food supply, develops its own technologies, and builds its own defense industry, it has the capacity to say no without fear of collapse. That is precisely what we see in India's decision today. The move is not reckless, it is calculated. It is not antagonistic, it is strategic. India is signaling to the world that its policies will be rooted in its own evaluation of what benefits its citizens, not in the preferences of distant capitals. For example, if energy security requires importing fuel from a particular source despite external disapproval, India will do so. If maintaining stability in Asia requires dialogue with multiple partners, including those who may not be America's closest friends, India will pursue it. This is sovereignty in action, not just in words. It is also important to recognize the deeper philosophical tradition that informs India's choices. From the days of independence, India has insisted on the principle of non-alignment, not because it sought to isolate itself, but because it understood that real independence meant freedom of judgment. Over time, that principle has evolved into what we now call strategic autonomy. India is willing to work with anyone, but it will not work under anyone. That is the heart of its foreign policy today, and it explains why this move resonates so powerfully both within India and abroad. For students of international politics, there is a critical lesson here. Sovereignty is not an abstract idea, but a practical capacity. A nation cannot declare itself independent on the world stage unless it has invested in the tools of independence at home. India's commitment to building a strong agricultural base, to fostering education, to advancing science and technology, and to sustaining a robust democracy. All of these have created the foundation for today's assertion of independence. Without those investments, the claim of sovereignty would be hollow. With them, it becomes a living reality. This moment also reflects a psychological shift. For many years, Indian leaders often felt constrained, worried about whether a certain policy would anger one power or please another. Today, the tone is different. The message is clear. India will listen, it will engage, it will negotiate, but ultimately, it will decide. That shift in mindset, from caution to confidence, is perhaps the most powerful element of this new foreign policy posture. Confidence, after all, is not born overnight. It comes from decades of preparation, resilience in the face of crisis, and a growing sense of national pride. Now, let us reflect on what this means for the world. A sovereign and confident India is not a destabilizing force. Quite the contrary, it is a stabilizing power. Because when a nation makes decisions out of its own strength rather than out of weakness or dependence, those decisions are more predictable, more sustainable, and more rooted in long-term stability. The world benefits when India acts from a position of strength because it ensures that India can be a reliable partner in global challenges, from climate change to counterterrorism to economic development. Finally, this is not only about India, it is a reminder to all nations, large and small, that sovereignty is something to be protected, nurtured, and exercised. No country can rely forever on the goodwill of others. True independence requires building the domestic foundations that allow a country to stand tall. That is the deeper meaning of what India has just demonstrated. It is not only a signal to Washington, it is a lesson to the entire international community about what it takes to be sovereign in the 21st century. The move India has made underscores a profound reality of our time. The old categories of alliances and adversaries no longer capture the complexity of international relations. For much of the 20th century, nations were expected to pick a side. During the Cold War, the world was divided into two camps, the U.S.-led Western Bloc and the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc. Nations that tried to remain in between, like India, were often seen as outsiders to the real centers of power. But the 21st century is writing a different story. India is demonstrating that it does not need to be confined by binary choices. Instead, it is practicing what we now call multi-alignment, engaging simultaneously with multiple partners issue by issue based not on ideology or allegiance, but on practical interests and shared opportunities. This approach is both sophisticated and forward-looking. It reflects an understanding that global challenges today do not fall neatly along old fault lines. Climate change, for example, cannot be solved by one bloc of nations while others are excluded. Counterterrorism, too, requires cooperation that transcends traditional alliances. Technology and trade weave countries together in ways that no single camp can dominate. In such a world, India's decision to engage broadly, sometimes with the U.S., sometimes with Russia, sometimes with partners in Asia, Africa, or Europe, illustrates the flexibility required for modern diplomacy. It is not neutrality in the passive sense. It is an active and deliberate strategy of maximizing options. Critically, this does not mean India is abandoning principles. Rather, it means that India is refusing to be reduced to someone else's junior partner. When it cooperates with the United States on defense, it is not at the cost of its engagement with Russia on energy. When it speaks about democracy and human rights with Europe, it does not abandon dialogue with countries in its own region that may not share the same values. The goal is balance, not dependence. That balance is the essence of multi-alignment, and it is precisely what makes India's recent move so consequential. For Washington, this can be disorienting. American policymakers are accustomed to nations aligning closely and consistently with U.S. priorities. When a partner diverges, it can feel like betrayal. But what India is teaching the world is that divergence does not equal disloyalty. A nation can be a strong partner in one arena while maintaining independence in another. This is not duplicity, it is maturity. It is what we should expect from rising powers that have their own responsibilities and constituencies. The sooner the United States adapts to this reality, the stronger the partnership can become, because it will be based on respect rather than control. Students of international affairs should note that this is part of a larger trend. We are moving into a multipolar world where power is distributed more widely and where no single country can dictate the global agenda. Nations like India, Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa are all asserting their own agency, often through regional groupings or issue-based coalitions. The term Global South has come to represent this rising influence. But the common thread is the rejection of binary choices. These countries want to work with the United States, but they also want to preserve their own space. They want cooperation with China, but not dependence. They want ties with Europe, but on equal footing. Multi-alignment is not unique to India, but India is perhaps the most visible and decisive practitioner of it at scale. And what makes India's case especially striking is the confidence with which it is being pursued. Multi-alignment can sometimes look like indecision, a refusal to commit. But in India's hands, it looks like a bold statement. We are open to everyone, but subordinate to no one. This clarity of purpose allows India to engage constructively across the board without losing sight of its own national priorities. It ensures that when India says yes, it is a genuine yes, not a reluctant concession. And when it says no, it is not an act of hostility, but an affirmation of independence. That consistency builds credibility, even if it does not always bring immediate agreement. The world benefits from this posture in several ways. First, it allows India to act as a bridge. By maintaining ties across divides, India can mediate, facilitate dialogue, and lower tensions. Second, it expands the room for cooperation. When India partners with multiple countries, it brings diverse groups into the same conversation. Third, it demonstrates a model for other nations that feel trapped between great powers. India shows that it is possible to navigate complex pressures without surrendering sovereignty. This is a powerful lesson for developing countries that seek to maintain autonomy while engaging with larger players. It is worth emphasizing, however, that multi-alignment is not an easy strategy. It requires constant balancing, careful diplomacy, and deep understanding of multiple partners' priorities. It also demands strong domestic foundations because only a nation with resilience at home can afford flexibility abroad. India's growing economy, vibrant democracy, and technological advancements give it the tools to manage this complexity. Without them, multi-alignment would risk looking like opportunism. With them, it becomes a sustainable and respected strategy. As we reflect on India's recent move, we should recognize that this is not just about one decision or one relationship. It is about the emergence of a new kind of global politics where nations define their roles on their own terms. For the United States, this is not a defeat. It is an invitation to evolve. If Washington can see India not as a subordinate ally, but as an independent partner, then cooperation can flourish in ways that serve both nations and the world at large. For India, it is a declaration of confidence. And for the rest of the world, it is a reminder that the old categories no longer hold. The future belongs to those who can build diverse, flexible, and resilient networks of engagement. The United States has long been accustomed to playing the role of the dominant power in global affairs, shaping not only the international system, but also the policies of individual nations. For much of the post-World War II period, Washington carried an aura of inevitability. Its preferences were not simply requests, but often treated as rules of the international order. Smaller nations, and even some large ones, learned to adapt to this reality, sometimes reluctantly, but almost always with the understanding that the costs of defiance would be steep. Yet what India has just demonstrated is that this model no longer holds. A rising power, confident in its own strength, is capable of saying no to the United States and doing so without fear of isolation. This moment highlights a larger truth. The era of unilateral dominance is giving way to an era of negotiation, dialogue, and partnership. This development should not be seen as a rejection of the United States, nor as an embrace of another power at America's expense. Rather, it is the inevitable adjustment of international politics to reflect the diffusion of power across multiple centers. India's recent decision illustrates this shift vividly. It reminds us that the leverage once enjoyed exclusively by Washington is now shared more widely. Nations like India can negotiate on equal terms, not out of defiance, but because they have built the capabilities and partnerships that allow them to stand independently. This is not a challenge to America's role. It is a redefinition of how that role must be exercised. For decades, U.S. diplomacy often relied on a mixture of incentives and pressures to achieve desired outcomes. The implicit assumption was that nations either fell in line with Washington's expectations or risked penalties. That approach may have been effective in an earlier era when the U.S. commanded overwhelming economic, military, and ideological power. But today, as India's actions show, the cost-benefit calculation has changed. The United States remains powerful, but it is no longer the sole architect of the global system. Other nations have developed economic resilience, diversified partnerships, and strategic leverage that allow them to withstand and even reject American pressure. India's decision underscores that truth in a way that is impossible to ignore. This is not to say that America's influence is disappearing. Far from it. The United States remains a central player in global politics, and its alliances, innovations, and values still matter enormously. But what India has shown is that influence cannot be equated with control. The ability to persuade is not the same as the ability to dictate. For the United States, this means that the tools of diplomacy must evolve. Respect must replace unilateralism, partnership must replace paternalism, and dialogue must replace pressure. If Washington wants to maintain strong relationships in this new world, it must embrace the reality of equality among partners, even when those partners occasionally choose differently. India's decision is a clear example of this. By declining to yield to American expectations in one sphere, while continuing to cooperate in many others, India is sending a signal that the relationship with Washington is valuable, but not at any price. The U.S. cannot expect automatic compliance. It must instead win agreement through mutual interest and respect. This is a profound shift, not just in the U.S.-India relationship, but in the way America must think about its global role. It is a recognition that respect, dialogue, and partnership are not optional extras. They are the new foundation of effective diplomacy. For observers of international relations, this moment is also a reminder of how power is changing form. In the past, raw military might or economic dominance could compel nations to align with one bloc or another. Today, power is more distributed, and influence often comes from credibility, trust, and the ability to offer meaningful cooperation. India's rise as a credible global actor, rooted in its democratic institutions, its growing economy, and its independent foreign policy, gives it the authority to engage with the U.S. as an equal. Washington cannot simply direct India, it must convince India. And that requirement marks the difference between an old order and a new one. There is also an important lesson here for the United States itself. If American policymakers view moments of resistance as betrayals, they risk alienating partners who are otherwise deeply invested in cooperation. But if they view such resistance as the natural expression of sovereignty and independence, they can build stronger, more sustainable relationships. India's move, then, should be interpreted not as a setback, but as a test of whether the United States can adapt to a multipolar world. If it can, then both India and the U.S. stand to gain from a relationship that is more balanced, more resilient, and more enduring. For India, this is a moment of affirmation. It is not rejecting the U.S. It is reminding the world that it does not belong to any one camp. It has the confidence to say no when necessary, and the wisdom to say yes when it serves its people. That independence is the essence of sovereignty, and it is why India is increasingly seen as a key player in shaping the international order of the 21st century. For the U.S., it is a moment of reckoning. Influence cannot be exercised through coercion, but through persuasion. Partnerships cannot be sustained through dominance, but through mutual respect. In the end, India's decision tells us something about the future of global politics. The age of unilateral commands is behind us. The age of negotiation, respect, and partnership lies ahead. The United States must learn to operate in this new environment, and India has just given it a powerful reminder of what that means. And it is not a rejection of American leadership. It is an invitation for America to lead differently. And for all of us, it is a lesson in how sovereignty, confidence, and partnership will define the world in the years to come. For anyone studying international relations, public policy, or simply trying to understand how nations navigate the complexities of our modern world, India's recent decision offers a lesson that goes far beyond the immediate headlines. It is not simply about a single transaction, a diplomatic exchange, or even a disagreement between two powerful countries. Rather, it is a window into the deeper forces shaping the 21st century. At its heart, this episode shows that the future belongs to nations that build resilience within their own societies, think strategically about their place in the world, and balance lofty ideals with the practical realities of national interest. When we speak about resilience at home, we mean the ability of a country to withstand shocks, whether they are economic, political, or environmental. A country without resilience will always be vulnerable to external pressure. And because even the smallest disruption can cause instability, India's ability to make an independent choice, even in the face of American pressure, stems from the resilience it has cultivated over decades. Its economy is large enough to absorb shocks. Its democratic institutions, though imperfect, are strong enough to withstand political turbulence. Its investments in technology, agriculture, and infrastructure have created a base of self-reliance. All of these factors combine to give India the confidence to say, we will decide for ourselves. That is resilience in action, and it is a quality every nation must seek to build. Equally important is the ability to think strategically abroad. Too often, nations fall into the trap of reacting to immediate pressures without a clear sense of long-term goals. India, by contrast, has pursued a foreign policy that is deliberate and calculated, aiming to maximize its options while minimizing its vulnerabilities. Its strategy is not to align permanently with one bloc or another, but to maintain the flexibility to engage with multiple partners depending on the issue at hand. This is not a lack of commitment. It is a recognition that in a multipolar world, no single relationship can provide all the answers. Thinking strategically abroad means planning for the future, understanding where one's interests lie, and ensuring that short-term decisions support long-term objectives. That is what India is demonstrating, and it is a model worth studying. But resilience and strategy alone are not enough. Nations must also balance ideals with practical interests. This is perhaps the hardest lesson of all. On the one hand, countries are guided by values, democracy, human rights, freedom of expression, or the rule of law. On the other hand, they must confront the reality that survival and prosperity sometimes require compromises, adjustments, or partnerships with countries that do not share those values. India's decision reflects this delicate balance. While it continues to uphold democratic ideals and to project itself as the world's largest democracy, it also engages pragmatically with nations whose political systems differ vastly. That may seem contradictory, but it is in fact a reflection of the complexity of modern diplomacy. A country that refuses to balance ideals with interests risks moral purity at the cost of national security. A country that ignores ideals entirely risks losing credibility and purpose. The challenge is to walk the line between the two, and India's recent action provides an example of how to attempt that balance. For students, policymakers, and citizens alike, this is a powerful case study. It demonstrates that independence on the world stage is not achieved in a single moment. It is the outcome of decades of preparation, careful planning, and undisciplined execution. When we see India asserting itself today, we are witnessing the culmination of choices made long ago. Investments in education that produced a skilled workforce, policies that built a diversified economy, and democratic traditions that gave legitimacy to its government. Without those foundations, today's act of independence would not have been possible. And this is an important reminder that sovereignty must be earned and maintained through effort at home, not simply declared abroad. There is also a broader message here for the international system. We are entering a world in which power is more distributed, alliances are more flexible, and nations have greater agency to chart their own paths. The rules of the 20th century no longer apply in the same way. The Cold War framework of fixed alliances and rigid blocs has given way to a more fluid, dynamic system in which countries pursue overlapping partnerships without permanent loyalties. India's move captures this reality with precision. It is not abandoning one partner for another. It is not retreating into isolation. It is asserting that the future belongs to countries that can navigate complexity with confidence and independence. For the United States, the lesson is equally clear. Pressure and coercion are no longer effective tools of diplomacy, particularly with nations that have the resources, population, and strategic weight of India. Partnership must be built on respect, on recognition of sovereignty, and on the understanding that even close friends will sometimes disagree. The world does not need America to dominate. It needs America to lead through cooperation, persuasion, and example. If the U.S. can internalize that lesson, it will not only strengthen its relationship with India, but also enhance its standing in the world. Ultimately, the story here is not about a rift between two nations, but about a global shift. India's decision is a reminder that the 21st century will not be defined by a single power imposing its will. It will be defined by nations that build resilience at home, think strategically abroad, and strike a balance between ideals and interests. That is why this moment is so educational, not only for policymakers, but for anyone trying to understand the future of global politics. India has just shown the world what it means to stand tall, not by rejecting partnerships, but by insisting on equality within them. And in doing so, it has offered all of us a powerful lesson about how nations can thrive in a changing world. So as we bring this discussion to a close, and let us be clear about what India's recent decision truly represents, it is not a fleeting moment of defiance, nor a rejection of partnership with the United States. It is a statement of confidence, a declaration that India's sovereignty is real, and that its place in the global order will be defined by its own choices. In many ways, it reflects the broader transformation of international relations in our time, away from rigid blocs and unilateral commands, and toward a world where dialogue, respect, and balance matter more than pressure. For the United States, this is a call to adapt. If Washington wants strong and enduring partnerships, it must approach rising powers like India not as subordinates, but as equals. That means listening as much as leading, cooperating instead of coercing, and building trust through shared interests rather than expecting automatic alignment. Such an approach will not weaken America's influence. It will strengthen it, because influence rooted in respect endures far longer than influence rooted in force. For India, this moment confirms a journey decades in the making. By investing in resilience at home, by thinking strategically abroad, and by balancing ideals with practical interests, India has built the capacity to stand tall on the world stage. That is no small achievement, and it offers a model for other nations that wish to safeguard their independence while engaging constructively with the wider world. And for all of us, the lesson is simple, but profound. The future belongs to those who prepare, who build from within, who stand for their principles, and who have the courage to navigate complexity with confidence. India has just reminded the world of that truth. The task before us is to learn from it, to adjust our approaches, and to recognize that sovereignty, respect, and partnership are the real currencies of global leadership in the 21st century. Thank you.